Silent Hill 2 is, in my opinion, an exceptional horror game. With this video, I want to not only discuss what I believe makes it special, but also offer some insight into the mindset and context I went into the game with. I've been wondering recently why I continuously gravitate towards horror media. Like many others, the genre has always had a captivating grasp on my attention. Everyone has their subjective reasons for why we consume horror entertainment. It may stem from the simple thrill of being frightened. This surface-level appeal is a valid one and something a lot of us likely share to some degree. Or the appeal is more specific to the individual, such as an interest in a select subgenre of horror. An example of this would be IPs such as Alien and Dead Space. These focus on mixing horror against the backdrop of deep and interesting science fiction universes.
There. Confirming visual contact with USG Ishimura.
The notion of seeking out media that scares us is a puzzle that is more easily solved from childhood. As a child, we understand this content is not intended for our consumption. There's the base level fear from the genre, with the added thrill of experiencing something reminiscent of forbidden fruit. At least, that's what I felt when I was around 11 years old, when a friend and I found a copy of The Ring that was hidden away by their parents. We didn't make it further than the film's prologue, for quickly realizing this was a mistake. The introduction sequence of The Ring frightened me so much I outright avoided anything horror related until my late teens, when I unexplainably found myself gravitating back towards the genre. I even rewatched the film in an attempt to scare myself again, only to end up demystifying it as not as terrifying as my childhood brain perceived it to be. But in this rewatch, I learned to appreciate other aspects of it. The cold, uninviting saturation of the color grading, the slow but gradual build-up of suspense before the actual scare, and the unnervingly dark secrets of its story. These elements probably feel familiar if you're a Silent Hill fan. And whilst I don't consider The Ring to be a masterclass example of a horror film, it was the one that piqued my interest and convinced me to watch other creations that better represent the genre. Films such as The Exorcist and The Shining, or TV shows like The Haunting of Hill House, and pretty much anything else Mike Flanagan has had creative control over.
Horror has been changing. It got to a point where the genre was content just to startle people. Now we're seeing audiences are much more sophisticated. In our show, I wanted to go back to when horror was actually about something much more profound than just being afraid.
So how does this appeal translate over to video games, and Silent Hill specifically? As an interactive medium, I feel horror is best experienced when we, as players, are given immediacy and control within the terrifying worlds and stories of the genre, especially when they are also conjured by those who understand the craft to make something truly terrifying. Fortunately, as I'm sure many of you can attest to, we've been quite lucky when it comes to horror in the video game space. Previously mentioned games such as Dead Space threw us in the middle of an increasingly dilapidated space station, filled with enemies that are drenched in body horror designs. Or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, with its unsettling atmosphere and richly detailed backstory. Even games that I would class as horror-light titles, such as The Last of Us, provided complex characters that are haunted by ghosts from their pasts. Despite being a huge fan of these games and others like them, you may be surprised to learn that I had very limited experience with the Silent Hill franchise. The exception to this is PT, the 2014 Silent Hills demo that was hiding under the guise of a playable teaser for what was at the time an unknown game. I'm very grateful to have experienced this as someone who was unaware of its true nature. This ingenious marketing is noteworthy by its own right, but the demo itself was also a genuinely harrowing experience, assisted by some big talented names tied to it. Acting as a return for the franchise, PT or Silent Hills would have been the perfect jumping in point for newer fans, and a continuation for existing ones. You can imagine my disappointment when the game got cancelled alongside other drama surrounding the departure of its creative leads. Under the impression that we weren't going to receive a contemporary entry in the Silent Hill franchise, I made peace with this and focused my energy on the other great titles out there. But PT's effect is still clear to see across the industry. as many other indie developers have adopted its first-person presentation and looping level design. These are echoes of the game we never got. So whilst I was genuinely excited when Bloober Team announced Silent Hill 2, I still held a healthy dose of apprehension towards the remake of the 2001 survival horror classic. Even more so because, despite it being over 2 decades old, I had never seen any spoilers or gleaned a clear understanding of what the original game was about. I'd known enough to understand this wasn't going to be the same experience as PT, as the design philosophies of each are distinctly different. I was just excited to finally play a Silent Hill game.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
I can now say, having recently completed Silent Hill 2, that I'm grateful to finally understand why this game holds such a special place in the hearts of many. I'm also a little disappointed that I never gave the original run of games a try, but from what I've seen, the remake appears to be an authentic modernization of the second game. When reverting back to my opening statement, I also have to thank Silent Hill 2 for helping me gain a clearer understanding of why I love the horror genre. It ticks so many of the boxes I didn't even realize I was bringing into these experiences. Some I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to. From the very opening section, Silent Hill 2 provides us with ample time to soak in its melancholic atmosphere. With only a map for guidance, the slow, gradual approach towards the town makes each step feel like a descent into its decadent world. There are subtle reminders preventing us from getting too comfortable. Rocks slip down from the cliffside. Strange etchings mark the door of an abandoned church, and a heavy fog makes the outside feel claustrophobic and uninviting. The whole purpose of this introductory sequence feels like the developers ensuring a careful and measured pace for the game is established. Even our first encounter with one of Silent Hill 2's supporting characters extend this philosophy. The conversation is an exchange of carefully chosen words and lingering pauses between dialogue. Everything feels deliberate, and everything is drenched in ambiguity.
This town, there's something wrong with it. And it's not just the fog either.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe.
It would have been tempting for the developers of both the original game and the remake to throw us into a frightening or shocking situation early on to grab our attention. This isn't necessarily a bad way to structure an introduction. Some games have had great results from this. But I really appreciated the restraint in Silent Hill 2's design. It trusts and encourages players to take their time and immerse themselves. For me, this set the pace in which I would maintain throughout my playtime, checking every nook and cranny for supplies, notes, or environmental decor. With so much media constantly vying for our attention, it was a nice change of pace to slow things down and appreciate the smaller, granular details. A slightly crude but effective method by which I like to evaluate horror is the measure of how long it takes for a creator to draw their metaphorical bowstring. If we assume the release of an arrow represents a frightening moment, or jump scare, the pacing and care by which it is drawn can make or break this moment's effectiveness. Television shows such as Midnight Mass distribute large portions of screen time to gradually build up the intrigue and tension before finally releasing this arrow. Generally speaking, the longer the build-up, the more impactful the moment. This approach is something Silent Hill 2 adopts to similarly positive results, with even smaller moments serving as micro arrow knocks. For example, our first steps into the town are met with silence. As we approach the plant shop, one of the first explorable buildings, we see what appears to be a blood trail on the floor. Inside the building, we're surrounded by dead plants, the environmental design indicating this location has been abandoned for some time. A small note allows us to glean some information, though it remains intentionally baked in mystery. As we begin to exit, a large bug can be seen scurrying across the floor, followed by a larger blood trail.
What is this?
It's a small moment, but it shows an attention to detail and care towards the craft and maintenance of this game's tone. Silent Hill 2 is full of moments like this, from subtle audio cues to more intense and sudden enemy encounters. This variety, especially when exploring the more openly designed sections of the game, encourage you to stay vigilant and move deliberately, because each building could contain either of these minor or major moments, or perhaps a combination of both. Ensuring you're prepared for either scenario is therefore crucial. Resource management is an important component in survival horror games, and Silent Hill 2 is no exception. James's equipment and weapon arsenal is not as in-depth as characters such as Isaac Clarke's. We don't possess vast amounts of plasma cutter cartridges or have stasis to fall back on. Every bullet matters, and each shot fired needs to be exact. Again, this complements and contributes towards the slower pacing, as thorough exploration will compensate you with precious ammo or first aid items. You'll need all you can carry to endure the horrors that await. Silent Hill 2's enemy roster isn't large. It was perhaps tempting for Bloober Team to create and include a few new enemy designs for the sake of variety in the remake, but they instead chose to remain faithful to the source material. A choice I think was the right one. I'm not someone that believes less is more is always the correct philosophy, but when it comes to horror games, I believe this to be exactly the case. The lying figures are the first monsters we encounter in the game. Based on the first impression of their appearance, with their skin-wrapped straitjackets and constrained limb maneuverability, you'd be forgiven for writing these off as just tutorial enemies to test combat mechanics on. But not only do the lying figures appear throughout the game, their presentation is often deceiving. As the name suggests, they position themselves low to the ground but move surprisingly fast. If you're not quick enough, you can find yourself covered in their acidic spray, which deals significant damage. A single lying figure on their own is manageable even early on, but when multiple appear, they quickly become a formidable threat. The second most common enemy type we're introduced to are the mannequins. I think we can all agree the idea of mannequins coming to life is a terrifying thought. Silent Hill 2 presents this idea, but not quite in the way I expected. The design of the mannequins in this game are essentially a pair of legs stacked on top of one another. Whilst this aesthetic could have easily ended up looking a little silly, its execution here is more akin to something residing deep within the uncanny valley, especially when paired with their strange movements and lack of any perceivable head. It didn't matter how many times I encountered these monsters, each time I felt unsettled by their appearance. Similar to the lying figures, they can also be challenging enemies to defeat, with later designs also introducing an added layer of verticality to their movements, allowing them to spring on you from above. But truthfully, these enemies also gave me the majority of the jump scares during my playthrough. They're wonderfully effective at playing hide and seek. Often their strange aesthetic matches the desaturated colour hues of the environment, camouflaging them from a passing glance. Coupled with their ability to remain completely still, meant they got the jump on me more times than I'd like to admit. The third enemy type that appears most often are the bubblehead nurses. Naturally, we encounter these enemies at Brookhaven Hospital, although their presence does persist after this location. These creepy porcelain-like nurses require the most thought during melee combat, as you have to be more specific when timing dodges due to their numerous consecutive swings. The standard nurses holding pipes were manageable, but their knife-wielding counterparts were more challenging to take down. It was these enemies that I found myself switching to one of the free firearm weapons to dispatch them from a distance. At close range, their knife swings are fast and deal considerable damage. From an aesthetic standpoint, I initially dismissed their design as a byproduct of the source material being developed in the early 2000s. Without going into specifics, all I'd like to note for those unaware is that the monster designs in Silent Hill 2 are intentional. They're a ramification of a darker, more elusive story at play. So I'd like to take this opportunity to advise that from this point onwards, I am going to be covering some of the mid to late game content of Silent Hill 2. This will include the designs of the bosses, but also the darker themes being presented beneath the surface of the plot. If you wish to avoid spoilers, I'd just like to thank you for watching. As someone who went into this game unaware, I would hate to rob anyone who wishes to discover Silent Hill 2's story revelations for themselves. If you're still here because you're an existing fan of the game or unbothered by spoilers, let's talk about the elephant in the room. These enemies aren't just monsters. They're manifestations of guilt, loss, resentment, and even sexual frustration. Whilst they do pose a very real external threat, they also represent a conflict that's happening internally. Upon a first playthrough, James appears to fit the motif of a haunted protagonist, someone who has a character ghost. This is described in John Tribby's book The Anatomy of Story not as a paranormal entity, but instead an event from the past that is still haunting the hero in the present, and the hero's internal opponent. A character type seen before in games such as The Last of Us, but where Joel in that game has an internalized ghost used as an obstacle to prevent him from forming an attachment to Ellie.
No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Silent Hill 2 takes a different approach. It externalizes the ghost of the protagonist. Each monster represents a different corner of James's psyche. Following the loss of his late wife Mary, who we are initially told passed away to a terminal illness. The ingenuity of this plot point is only revealed when we reach the ending of the game. In one of the final cutscenes, we learn that whilst this illness was responsible for Mary's declining health, it wasn't the cause of her death. In this moment, the events of Silent Hill 2 are recontextualized and given greater meaning. On a meta level, it provides a strong incentive to replay the game with this newfound context. But also, from the perspective of horror, and if you'll remember my bow and arrow analogy earlier, it means the whole game acted as the slow draw of a bowstring, with the reveal of the horrific truth being the arrow's release, the revelation that James actually killed his wife.
I killed her.
We'll cover the exact nature of this later on, as his reasons, whilst indefensible, are nuanced and multi-layered. But before I get ahead of myself, I want to revert back to the monster designs with this context now in mind. Looking back to the ones we already discussed, we can see the lying figure's straitjacket design connotes a psychiatric hospital patient in agonizing distress, a glimpse into James's internal turmoil and suffering, both during Mary's illness and following her death. The mannequin and bubblehead nurse's provocative appearance juxtaposed by their faceless models, a suggestion towards the guilt and shame James feels from his sexual frustration, unable to look Mary in the eye to admit her illness had affected the wants and desires that were previously satisfied by their relationship.
I think I can see why. It's too bad we have to leave. Promise you'll take me again, James.
The game's iconic Pyramid Head monster is a cruel, murderous being. A manifestation to remind and punish James for the unspeakable act he committed. The disturbingly named Flesh Lips monster, an almost H.R. Geiger design nod towards the aforementioned sexual frustration. This creature is also confined to a bed-shaped frame, alluding to Mary's bedbound state towards the end of her life. This wonderfully disturbing design intent echoes across the entire game, and by externalizing James's character Ghost, the gameplay is also given greater meaning. We typically see the impactful moments of a character's arc reserved specifically for cinematic cutscenes. Whilst Silent Hill 2 does have plenty of narrative beats reserved for cutscenes, the externalization of James's internal opponents also allow us to have direct control in the key moments by which he overcomes them. This is something I believe only a video game could achieve, as through our control we gain empathy. Our alignment to James's actions equally align us to his motivations, fears, and desires. The physical space also represents the hope for emotional resolve. So when defeating a challenging boss, we not only feel the typical satisfaction gained from survival, but also the satisfaction of watching James successfully wrestle his internal demons.
I don't need you anymore. I'm ready.
This design philosophy extends to the supporting cast as well. Characters such as Angela equally have their trauma externalized as James aids her in overcoming the memories of her abusive father, in the form of the abstract daddy. Whilst I'm not sure on the name, the actual design aesthetic of this monster is striking and terrifying. The character of Maria is likewise a manifestation, a confidently sexualized version of Mary that has an almost immediate attraction towards James, trying to cater towards his more primal desires.
What are you doing?
Something to take the edge off.
This character is conjured from the same part of his mind as the Bubblehead nurses, but with the added unease of having the face of his late wife. Naturally, the interactions between these characters is one of nuance, layered with uncertain flirtation, confusion, remorse, even annoyance, but also a genuine care for one another.
Don't you want to touch me?
I don't know.
It's therefore fitting that this ultimate manifestation of Mary serves as the game's final boss. Her final form even sporting the same bed frame confinement as the Flesh Lips monster. Silent Hill 2 took a narrative turn I wasn't expecting. In both 2001 and 2024, exploring the ways in which loss can be confusing and not just underpinned by sadness is a brave endeavour, close to a lot of people's hearts. Using the character of James to highlight the guilt of harbouring anger and resentment undeservingly towards a terminally ill loved one is scary and unfortunately a terrifying reality for a lot of people. The game shows us that James is not only mourning Mary and the life they had, but also the one they planned together. It takes the notion of "till death do us part" to a whole new level, as James selfishly longs for Mary's passing so that he can move on, despite the fact he still loves and cares for her. Whilst his actions at the end of her life are indefensible, it's frightening to admit that they are given context. Enough so that this action doesn't feel out of place or forced, but a genuine part of James's journey.
The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
If that's true, then why do you look so sad?
Mary.
It's okay, James.
It's a testament to the game to stick the landing of this moment, as if not given the proper care and attention, it could have easily gone the other way. If you've played the game, you likely feel the same confusion of anger and sadness towards the character we're controlling. James somehow felt like both a monster but also a victim of his own grief. It's confusing, but also human. I opened this video talking about what brings me back to the horror genre, and thanks to this game, I think I've got the answers. I love creepy atmospheres, slow pacing, amazing set designs, and interesting monsters. But most importantly, I love the fact that this genre is an open space to explore darker themes that would otherwise feel out of place. It allows creators to have the courage to take a leap of faith with their storytelling. This isn't always executed effectively, but I can say that I genuinely believe it is here in Silent Hill 2. That about covers my thoughts on the game and the horror genre at large. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. I really appreciate you spending your time here. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel if this resonated with you, as there's plenty more on the way. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you later.